Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be Part 10, Day 17. It had been a very, very long time since Toshinori set foot in the dilapidated building Gran Torino called home. It was a place with both good and bad memories. While it was Gran's home, Shimura-sensei had frequented it too. Now that she was gone, though, the bad tended to outweigh the good. Toshinori's memories of Shimura-sensei's laughter were fuzzy and faded with age, but the memory of the brutal training he had received from Gran to protect him from that man still left phantom pains on his body, and an ache in his heart as he slowly came to realize that maybe it was all for nothing. He may never fight All For One. He may never get justice for Nana. He may never get to fulfill the purpose of One for all because of a single, sickly baby. He couldn't begrudge the baby anything. He was a baby. The baby had no control over his parentage, or his condition, or what that meant for the world at large. He wanted the baby to recover quickly and live a good, happy, safe life. That didn't mean that Toshinori's life wouldn't be easier without the baby complicating things. Toshinori sighed, his thoughts suffocating, and knocked. There was no point in pushing the thoughts away. Gran had called him here to talk, and there was only one thing he could possibly want to talk about. "Come in, Toshinori," Gran's voice called from inside. "It's unlocked." "Is that really wise?" Toshinori asked as he opened the door. Gran snorted from his place on the couch, a plate of taiyaki and a glass of something that looked alcoholic on the table nearby. "You doubted my ability to defend myself, boy." No, of course not," Toshinori said, backtracking quickly, even as he closed and locked the door behind him. "It's not like that door's going to stop anyone who would be a real threat anyway," Gran said bitterly. Toshinori stood there, silently, reality weighing heavy on his shoulders. He walked over and sat next to Gran. Gran silently poured him a glass of whatever it was he was drinking. "No, probably not," Toshinori said eventually. There was a chance All For One had some kind of teleportation quirk and had secretly been disappearing from the hospital to do evil, but he couldn't help but think of how quickly All For One had disappeared back into that hospital room after their meeting. He couldn't help but think of how tired he had looked. Toshinori had doubts he had ever left that room, much less the hospital. Gran took a drink. "You've been thinking of that baby a lot, huh, Toshinori?" he asked. "It's hard not to," Toshinori admitted. Gran grunted in agreement. "Enough to come up with some half-baked adoption plan?" he asked. Toshinori huffed, looking at his old mentor out of the corner of his eyes. "That had been spur of the moment." "Clearly," Gran said, snorting. "You think I couldn't do it?" Toshinori asked seriously, his arms resting on his knees. "I don't think you should have children till they can cook for themselves," Gran said, throwing back his glass. The comment stabbed into his heart. Toshinori frowned and looked down at the floor, his chest aching. "But I think you would have managed," Gran said quietly. Toshinori looked over at him. Gran stared back. "Thank you, Gran," Toshinori said softly. Gran grunted. "Don't thank me for the truth, Toshinori." Toshinori smiled softly and sat back again. There was companionable silence for a while, the late sun peeking through the windows. "Tell me, Toshinori," Gran asked, "if you had been thinking, even unconsciously, about taking in that kid, why do you even have a list of terms for leaving a child with that monster?" Toshinori looked over at Gran to find him staring. His eyes were hard, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. Toshinori turned to his cup, watching his fingers fiddle against the glass. Gran pressed. "We've seen that he has no qualms with killing children when they get in his way. What's going to happen to the kid when he gets tired of playing house?" Toshinori sighed heavily, watching the sunspots scattered by the glass shift as dusk fell. He stared at his thumb. "It's not that I want to leave a child with him, Gran. I think it's a terrible idea, especially for the baby. But at the same time—" Gran grunted, prompting him. "At the same time, the day I confronted All For One in that hospital room, I had never expected him to look as awful as he did." Toshinori huffed a humorless laugh. "I had expected him to lord this new hostage over me. I had expected him to gloat about catching me in a place where I could never fight back. At the very least, I'd expected him to look put together. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, Gran, nor eaten in just as long. He wasn't even wearing a suit. I'm pretty sure he was wearing scrubs from the hospital itself. Gran said nothing, simply kept watching and waiting. Watching him there. I suppose it just felt like he was off. He even seemed genuinely worried at one point, and the way he acted when the baby got upset. It was like this baby was more of a priority than me. He put his back to me, Gran, without a second thought. And then there were the paternity results. Toshinori sighed again. It feels, at least right now, that if I don't let All for One keep his son, give him a chance, he will go berserk, and all of Japan will pay the price. So, Gran said at length, what I'm getting is that Nezu's convinced you, huh? Yes, a bit, Toshinori admitted reluctantly. Gran snorted, draining the last of his drink and slamming it on the table. Unbelievable. Toshinori watched Gran warily out of the corner of his eye. The clock ticked quietly as Toshinori watched Gran glare at nothing. You should have taken him out when you had the chance. Toshinori jolted, looking at Gran with his mouth hanging open. Gran met his eyes, his jaw set and arms crossed. I was in a hospital, Gran, Toshinori protested. Besides, you were the one that told me not— Since when do you listen to me, boy? Gran thundered, kicking up a leg and blasting the table, and the taiyaki, across the room as he jumped to his feet and stuck a finger in Toshinori's face. Toshinori did not flinch. They stared at each other, unblinking. I could not do that, Gran, and you know it, Toshinori said softly. Gran growled. Had we been anywhere else, I would have. But there were infants there, Gran. Tiny infants. I would have never forgiven myself. Gran snarled and broke away, pacing. I haven't forgiven myself for making him cry. Gran stumbled over his own feet and stared at Toshinori with bug eyes. Toshinori blinked. All for one, Gran shouted. Toshinori choked. No, Toshinori yelled back. The baby. Oh, Gran said, recollecting himself. Toshinori looked down at his hand, staring at his thumb. I think, he admitted. It was hard to tell. Some piece of medical equipment went off, and he looked like he was crying, but I didn't hear anything. Gran grunted, slowly walking back over and flopping back on the couch next to him. Toshinori didn't look over. What's so interesting about your thumb all of a sudden, eh? Gran asked. I've noticed you doing that a lot lately. The baby's foot was this big, Toshinori said, motioning to the first joint of his thumb. Gran went still. You sure it wasn't a trick of the light or something? He asked. Toshinori sighed. I suppose I can't be sure. It was hard to see him. All for One didn't let me get close, and he wasn't in a crib. It looked more like a glass cage or something. All I could really see were his feet and hands, but they were small, Gran, smaller than I thought was possible. Gran sighed heavily. Hard to imagine a baby smaller than a newborn. Katara was already too small, but Nana had always been scared of a preterm labor for a reason. That must have been part of it. They sat in silence. The clock ticked. Some of the taiyaki shifted, falling to the floor. The sun had disappeared, and the inky blue was creeping into the windows. Outside, street lights blinked on. It just isn't fair, Gran said. Toshinori looked at him. Gran was staring off in the distance, as if seeing something Toshinori could not. His arms were crossed, his expression a mix of anger, melancholy, and grief. It isn't fair that he gets to keep his kid, when Nana didn't, he said. Toshinori looked at the same spot. In his mind's eye, he could see Nana's bright smile, and feel the comforting warmth it still brought him. It isn't, Toshinori said. It really isn't. All right, listeners, this concludes Day 17 of All For You. Day 18 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.